The teaching at Wolverhampton, when I started, it relied on the figure. That whole thing, there was a thing called intermediate examination, and that was about making figures in different poses, and that was normally modelled in clay. In terms of material, the work that I did in Wolverhampton was in stone, it was in clay and plaster a lot. Working in plaster was like a mixture of carving and modelling, so it's a very useful thing. Also, at that time, I started working in steel. One of the teachers there, called Roy Kitchen, set up a machine shop. So I was very pleased to be able to try working in steel, which I've never done before. There was steel everywhere. So it was a new thing to be doing. One of the reasons I went into sculpture school is because I liked Tom Wright and I liked the people there. You are encouraged to sort of express yourself. And the first things I did were figurative. The first sculpture I did was some bathers, influenced by Rodin. He was influenced by Epstein. There were many, many figures falling through space. I was also interested in Dante, the Divine Comedy. So it was that whatever book Dante wrote where it was hell, it's that, all the figures fall into hell, with this huge Christ figure which came from Epstein at the top. When Tom Wright died, the sculpture school was taken over by Derwent Wise, who came from Newcastle University and as such had quite an influence on my life because he wanted me to continue my studies at Newcastle. One of the things that Derwent Wise did, I remember him saying that, you're ambitious sculpture, but you need to pin it to something. And he encouraged me to draw. He said, draw an object and analyse it and then translate that into a sculpture. What I did was, because in our house, believe it or not, we didn't have electricity, we had gas. I found a gas bracket and I drew from it. It looked like a figure. And it was influenced by the sculptor Jacques Lipchitz. So in many ways, the teaching that I had was very useful to me. One of the things about the Black Country is this, I think, this amazing sort of convergence of really fertile and beautiful nature, and you don't have to far to get out right into nature, and industry. So when I used to walk from my mother's house to my grandma's house, you could see the wren's nest, which is this famous outcrop of trees and of rocks, and it seemed to loom. And when I started this sculpture, I thought, I'd like to try and say something about that, which in a funny sort of way, it's gone on reverberating. And I've done it later in life without trying. But then I couldn't quite do it. It didn't quite work. But it was so powerful, this place, with the trees, and you could feel the sense of the movement of rocks. But one was terribly aware of the underground workings of the earth, really. And I used to walk around in that area, and it sort of sparked my imagination. The sculpture which I made with Roy Kitchen in newfangled metalworking shop, in fact, I made it first in plaster. But I was very interested in the idea of thinking about evolution and the nature of man within the world. So in many levels, the wren's nest became a place that I continually looked at, and I became terribly aware of the seasons and the movements of the earth and the movements of the clouds, and at the backdrop, this incredible industrial landscape. When I used to go and see my mother's mother, I used to have to walk up a hill where they lived, just outside Dudley, and you could see for miles and miles out across industry, nothing but industry. So one was always aware of this power of industry, which Mrs. Thatcher managed to take away. People often say, observe in my work that there is this mixture of natural things, growing things, and things which are constructed. I once heard W.H. Auden say that the most interesting train journey in the world, which is arguable, was the train journey between Wolverhampton and Birmingham. Nowadays, it looks not very exciting, but in 1950 or whatever, it was full of industry and the remains of the war. And so it was an incredibly exciting place, and it spoke of the Midlands industry. And so I was moved, I think, by hearing that. So it was this mixture of the industrial and the power of growing things that actually kept me going on. There isn't this big difference in my work between abstract and the architecture of the figure remains. You know, many of the things in the studio, at some point I studied a figure. I could never understood why I'd made Saint Sebastian until I read a book. Somebody wrote a book about where I went to school called Seminary Boy. He talks about, as we stood to go into church or wherever we were going, there was a huge picture of Saint Sebastian with arrows sticking out of him. I must have been using that imagery to do that. But it's all expressive, like elongated, pulling of the arms and feeling what it's like to have arrows shot in you. Not very nice, presumably. So it isn't just modelling the figure, it's what the figure is like under stress. Greeting the Sun is very much like, in a way, Saint Sebastian, in a sense that although it's not having arrows shot into it, it's pulling itself up. It's about the tension. You feel that it's under the ground, germinating, and then breaking out into the light. Ritual and rebirth. It's much more to do with synthetic cubism. I didn't set out to make a figure. The bottom part evolved, and I can't remember where it evolved from. The top part is like a figure by default, but it hasn't really got any of the tensions of the model sculptures where the sculpture is used in this expressive way. It actually relates to the nature of the figure. It also relates to a big disc, which you can obviously think of the sun or a head, but it also relates into Chinese art. There's a wonderful picture called The Ladies of the Court Learning Good Manners or something like that. And there is, within the centre of this picture, there's this big mirror, which would be a polished mirror, which almost looks exactly like that. In Tang poetry, or in Chinese poetry, there is more references to exile and to loneliness and to separation than anything else in any other form of poetry. Before I went to China, I went to Canada, and you wouldn't think so, but I found that a real shock to the system because of the landscape. I came back, this is a massive space of Canada, and then when I went to China, I was completely knocked out. And very few times in my life that it wasn't the impact on art, although that was a secondary thing, it was the impact on me. I felt as though I'd been slightly dismantled, and I didn't know who I was. China in 1993 was just on the cusp of change. I went to China 18 times between 1993 and mid-2000s. I went to a place called Xi'an, which was the old capital of China. And there was a Chinese guy and said, he leant across to me on the train, and he said, Xi'an is like a warrior, Hangzhou is like a young girl. And I'm astonished by it because the gentleness of Hangzhou is like some beautiful Chinese painting or a beautiful young girl. And Xi'an is like this incredible rich red earth and the capital of power and whatever. So it affected me on many, many levels going to China. And when I came back, I had to try and make sense of it. I really didn't know who I was. Voice of the Mountain, Southern Storm. I went to Guilin. They call it a karst landscape. The rocks have come up through the earth. It looks like a chocolate box on pictures, but when you could actually get up to them, it was like they've really come forced out of the ground. And it was extraordinary because you'd look at this and then you'd just walk outside where these mountains are, a roadway with lorries shooting up and down, and then you'd just walk off the roadway and you'd be in another world with peasants with things on their shoulders. But it was this landscape, and of course, what interested me, what I've tried to explain about this exhibition, is the caves at Guilin, which I went in. You go on a boat. Now, you'll immediately realise that you can go on a boat in Dudley, under the wren's nest, and you can walk about and you can see where the earth has come through. So I thought, Jesus Christ, I've come 6,000 miles and I've come to Dudley, although it's on a much bigger scale. What I was trying to do with that sculpture, and I was imagining that underneath the lake one would seek sort of solace beneath the surface of the lake where it's cool, and you look up through the things that are growing on the lake, the lotuses. I did a proposal for Merry Hill near Dudley, and of course the sea once was all across the wren's nest. So whenever you're walking around there, you feel as though this sea is all above you. If you imagine, you can say, oh God, this would have been sea. So that was the theme of putting a person underneath this sea. And I used the same idea when I was doing the thing in Hangzhou of somebody being under the water, and he was immersed within this, all these different sensations. The drawings are somehow all the pent-up feelings and emotions that went on. So I'm using memories, and I'm using all the experiences of making the sculpture in this very free way. Drawing is very intimate for me, and poetry is very intimate. You know, it comes from the same place really. And the model, you know, the model is very intimate. But when you get to make the things very big, it's on a different scale, and you use a different part of the brain. One of the constellations is called the Sculptor's Workshop. It was something which was known to Picasso. Someone told me, when the poet Apollinaire went into Julio Gonzalez's workshop, he likened it to the creation like in the big sense. There was all these bits of metal and fire and smoke and highly sort of noisy and whatever, and he thought this was like the moment of creation. So that sculpture, the huge circle on the top, that's more like cosmic, more like God. At the bottom there's all this activity of different pieces of material. I've still got many things that I want to do. I got more ideas, and I want to make better sculpture. Tiny dots on the horizon gliding, not colliding, on the waters of the sun's reflections, its radiant spiral enveloping the midday shadow, deepening, darkening, spreading in the oily blackness, in the empty coolness of the silent womb below the molten surface of the lake of fire.